On their fifth wedding anniversary, while she was 7 months pregnant, her husband handed her divorce papers, $10,000, and told her to get out, tonight. In the rain, his mother showed up with champagne and cardboard boxes. She walked into the nursery and threw every piece of baby clothing into a trash bag while Grace watched. Then the other woman arrived in a red designer dress and started measuring the windows for new curtains. They gave her 60 minutes to erase 5 years of her life. She walked out into the rain with a suitcase, a wet check, and a locket she had worn since she was 6 months old, the only thing that survived the car accident that killed her parents. Her husband called her background noise. His mother called her a stray cat. They were absolutely certain she was nobody, with nothing, going nowhere. But that locket held a secret that connected her to a name so powerful, so wealthy, so far beyond anything the Crawford family could imagine, that when the truth finally came out in a courtroom in front of a judge with 5 attorneys and a billionaire grandfather sitting behind her, her husband's entire empire didn't just crack. It collapsed, and he never saw it coming. Lesson and value. This story is proof of one truth that never changes. Your worth is not decided by the person who walks away from you. It is revealed by what you do after they leave. Never let someone else's cruelty become your identity. If this story gave you chills, drop a comment and tell me, what moment made your jaw drop? Hit that like button so this story reaches someone who needs to hear it tonight. Share it with a friend who deserves to know she is not nothing. And subscribe if you want more stories that hit different, because this channel does not do ordinary. I will see you in the next one. Dylan Crawford didn't just want to end his marriage. He wanted to erase it. He wanted to scrub every trace of his wife from his life the way you'd power wash a stain off a driveway, quickly, thoroughly, and without a second thought. He looked at the woman sitting across the living room, the woman who had washed his shirts and cooked his meals and carried his child for 7 months, a woman he believed was a penniless orphan he had rescued from a life of bus stops and ramen noodles, and he felt nothing, less than nothing. He felt the mild irritation of a man who has outgrown a pair of shoes and can't understand why they're still in his closet. But Dylan made one fatal mistake. He confused silence with stupidity. He mistook kindness for weakness, and he assumed that a woman with no money, no family, and no last name worth remembering could never, ever fight back. He had no idea that the signature on those divorce papers wouldn't just end a marriage. It would detonate a bomb that would level everything he had ever built, every lie he had ever told, and every cruel word he had ever whispered in the dark. This is the story of how a man threw away a queen to chase a pawn. And this is the story of how that queen burned his kingdom to the ground without ever raising her voice. The envelope was thick, creamy white, and unmistakably legal. It sat on the mahogany coffee table, exactly where a vase of flowers should have been. It was October 14th, a Wednesday, and it was Grace and Dylan Crawford's 5th wedding anniversary. Grace stood in the center of the living room of their Upper East Side townhouse, her hands still damp from washing the dishes. She had cooked Dylan's favorite meal, herb-roasted chicken with garlic mashed potatoes, homemade bread rolls, and a salad with the imported olive oil he liked. The dining table behind her was set for 2. White candles, a small anniversary card she had spent an hour writing by hand, and propped against a vase of grocery store daisies, the only flowers she could afford because Dylan controlled every dollar in the household, was the sonogram photo of their daughter. 28 weeks, a perfect profile, 10 tiny fingers. Grace was 32 years old. At 7 months pregnant, she moved carefully, one hand frequently resting on the curve of her belly. She was wearing her one nice maternity dress, a navy blue cotton dress from Target that cost $30. She had saved for it by skipping lunches for 2 weeks, telling Elena she wasn't hungry, packing a granola bar in her purse instead. Dylan wouldn't have noticed if she'd worn a burlap sack. Dylan hadn't really looked at her in over a year. She heard his key in the lock at 9:47. He was 3 hours late. She had texted him twice. The chicken had dried out at 8:30. She had turned the oven off at 9. The front door opened, and the sound of expensive shoes on hardwood echoed through the foyer. Dylan Crawford walked in carrying a gust of cold October air and the faint scent of whiskey and a perfume that was not Grace's. He was a handsome man in the way a razor is handsome, sharp, clean, and designed to cut. Dark hair, strong jaw, a body maintained by a personal trainer Grace was not allowed to use because, as Dylan put it, why would you need a gym membership when you get your exercise scrubbing the bathroom floor? He didn't look at Grace. He didn't look at the dinner table. He didn't look at the sonogram. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and then turned and leaned against the sideboard with the expression of a man completing an unpleasant but necessary task, like filing taxes or putting down a dog. He gestured at the coffee table with his glass. "You've seen it, then?" Grace looked at the envelope. She didn't need to open it. The atmosphere in this house had been dying for months, maybe years. The late nights that bled into early mornings, the new passcode on his phone that changed every week, the way he flinched when she touched his shoulder, as if her fingers were made of something unclean. She picked up the sonogram photo from the table where the envelope had been dropped on top of it. She wiped a crease from the corner and held it against her chest. "Happy anniversary, Dylan," she said softly. Her voice was steady, composed, a clear, quiet stream running over rocks. It was the voice that had always irritated Dylan because he could never crack it, never make it shake, never hear the satisfying sound of a woman breaking. Dylan let out a short, ugly laugh. "God, you're pathetic." Even now, no screaming, no throwing things, just happy anniversary. He took a long sip of bourbon and grimaced. "This is exactly why we're done, Grace. You have no fire, no ambition. You're furniture. You're the beige paint on a wall that nobody looks at." Grace held the sonogram a little tighter. "Is that what the papers say? Irreconcilable differences due to beige paint?" "They say whatever my lawyers drafted them to say," Dylan snapped. He set his glass down, hard on the sideboard, and a ring of bourbon splashed onto the polished wood. Grace's eyes flicked to it automatically, years of training making her want to wipe it up. She didn't move. "The point is, it's over. I've outgrown you, Grace. It happens. Stocks rise, stocks fall. You were a good investment when I was a junior associate and needed someone who kept the house clean and didn't ask questions. But I'm a name partner now. I close deals with people who summer in the Hamptons. I sit across the table from senators and CEOs. I need a wife who fits that world. Someone who can host a gala. Someone who walks into a room and people notice. Not someone who looks like she should be serving the appetizers." "Jetona." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Grace didn't flinch. She had heard variations of the speech for years, the slow drip of cruelty that Dylan dispensed, like a prescription. "You're lucky I found you. You'd be nothing without me. You have no family, no education, no history. I gave you everything. The least you can do is be grateful." "And your daughter?" Grace asked. She placed her hand on her belly. The baby kicked, a tiny foot or fist pushing against her palm. Dylan waved his hand in the air like he was swatting a fly. "Your daughter. I'll pay whatever the court says." $800 a month sounds about right for someone at your income level, which, let's be honest, is zero. Without me, you're back at the diner, Grace. That's just reality. Grace looked at the envelope. What are the terms? Generous, Dylan said, and he actually smiled. It was the smile of a man who believes he is being magnanimous while handing someone a grenade. You get $10,000, cash. Consider it severance pay for 5 years of service. You keep your clothes, your little locket thing, whatever junk you brought into this marriage, and you leave tonight. Tonight? Tonight. Dylan, it's raining. I'm 7 months pregnant, and Brittany's decorators arrive at 9 tomorrow morning. I want your things gone. I want your smell gone. That cheap soap you use because you claim you have sensitive skin. I want to open my closet and not see a single Target clearance tag. Grace looked at him. She really looked at him, the way you look at something for the last time. Memorizing the details, not out of love, but out of a need to remember what the danger looked like. She saw the bourbon-flushed cheeks, the hard, empty eyes, the expensive watch she had given him for their 3rd anniversary, bought with money she saved from the grocery budget by eating less so he could eat more. Can I at least stay until morning? She asked, not begging, just asking. No. The doorbell rang. Dylan's face changed. The irritation smoothed into something else, a flicker of anticipation, like a child who hears the ice cream truck. He walked to the door and opened it. Margaret Crawford stood on the threshold. She was 63 years old, thin as a whip, and dressed in a cream cashmere coat that she wore like a suit of armor. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her lips were pressed into a smile that had all the warmth of a closed bank vault. She was carrying a bottle of champagne in one hand and a stack of empty cardboard boxes in the other. Oh, good, Margaret said, walking past Dylan without waiting to be invited in. She didn't look at Grace. She hadn't looked directly at Grace since the wedding, when she had told her son, in a whisper, loud enough for the entire first row to hear, that marrying a foster child was like adopting a stray cat. It might seem noble at first, but eventually, you'd find hair on the furniture and regret it. She's still here, Margaret continued, setting the champagne on the counter with a decisive clink. I brought boxes. Let's get this moving. Margaret, Grace began. Don't. Margaret said sharply, finally turning to face her. She looked at Grace the way a health inspector looks at a cockroach on a kitchen counter. I've waited 5 years for this night, Grace. 5 years of watching my son waste himself on a woman who contributes nothing, who has nothing, who is nothing. So please spare me the waterworks and start packing. Margaret picked up the boxes and walked toward the stairs. Grace watched her, a cold dread settling into her stomach. Where are you going? Grace asked. The nursery, Margaret said over her shoulder. Brittany's already picked out the new theme. We need to clear out all that secondhand junk. Grace moved as fast as her pregnant body would allow. She reached the nursery doorway just in time to see Margaret pulling things off the shelves. The nursery was Grace's one sanctuary in the house, the one room Dylan had let her decorate because he had no interest in baby things. She had painted butterflies on the walls herself, soft yellows and pale pinks, spending hours on a stepladder with a foam brush. The crib was second-hand from a thrift store. Grace had sanded it down and repainted it white, spending 3 weekends to get the finish smooth enough that no splinters could ever touch her baby's skin. On the shelves were a small stack of onesies she had bought one at a time from Goodwill, each one washed twice and folded with care. Margaret picked up the stack of baby clothes. She held them at arm's length as if they smelled and dropped them into a black trash bag. Margaret, please, Grace said, and her voice cracked for the first time. Those are for the baby. Margaret looked at her with an expression of pure distilled contempt. Brittany will outfit this nursery properly. Pottery barn, Not Goodwill. This room will have proper furniture for a proper family. Grace gripped the doorframe. What do you mean, a proper family? Margaret smiled. It was the cruelest expression Grace had ever seen on a human face. Oh, didn't Dylan tell you? Brittany is 2 months along. A boy, they think. You didn't really believe you were special, did you, Grace? You were the placeholder, the practice wife, the rough draft before the real thing. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She looked at Dylan, who had appeared in the hallway behind her. He was leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone with one thumb. Is that true? Grace whispered. Dylan didn't look up. Does it matter? Sign the papers, Grace. Take the money. Go. Grace stood in the half-destroyed nursery, one hand on the doorframe, one hand on her belly, where her daughter was kicking, alive and oblivious, and depending entirely on a mother who had just been told she was disposable. The trash bag at Margaret's feet held every piece of clothing Grace had bought for her unborn child. She looked at Dylan, bored in the hallway. She looked at Margaret, triumphant by the crib, and something inside Grace, something that had been bending for 5 years under the weight of silence and gratitude and please don't leave me because I have nowhere else to go, that something didn't break. It went quiet. I'll pack, Grace said. She walked to the bedroom. She pulled her battered suitcase from the back of the closet, the same suitcase she had brought into this marriage 5 years ago. She packed 3 changes of clothes. She packed the photo of her parents, a grainy, faded image of a man and woman she had never known, standing in front of a garden she couldn't identify. She had carried this photo through 6 foster homes, 2 group homes, and 1 marriage. It was the only proof she had that she had once been wanted by someone. And she packed the small wooden jewelry box. Inside the box, resting on faded velvet, was a platinum locket, heavy, old, finely crafted. On the front was an engraving she had never been able to fully identify. It looked like a bird, maybe an eagle, clutching something in its talons. On the back were 3 initials, WWRB. The locket was the only thing she had from her biological parents. A social worker had given it to her when she was 6, told her it had been in the car when they found her after the accident that killed her parents. Grace had worn it every day of her life. Dylan called it costume jewelry. Margaret had once called it worthless junk. Grace put the locket around her neck and tucked it under her dress. She left every diamond Dylan had ever bought her in a neat pile on his pillow. The engagement ring, the tennis bracelet he gave her as an apology for missing Christmas, the earrings from their first anniversary that he forgot he had bought because his secretary picked them out. She carried her suitcase downstairs. The living room had changed. Brittany Voss had arrived. She was 28, blonde, spray-tanned, to the color of a butterscotch candy, and wearing a red designer dress that probably cost more than Grace's entire wardrobe combined. She was walking through the living room, pointing at things, and dictating changes to someone on her phone. The sofa goes, Brittany was saying, and all this gray, it's so depressing. I want cream and gold, and get rid of that dining set. It smells like... She paused, looking up as Grace came down the stairs, pregnant belly and suitcase and all. Brittany's eyes went wide for a theatrical second, and then her face arranged itself into a mask of exaggerated sympathy. Oh, wow, you're huge, Brittany said, lowering her phone. Don't worry, sweetie. I'll take great care of the nursery. I'm thinking all white, very clean, very fresh start. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, holding the champagne. She popped the cork. The sound echoed through the townhouse like a starting pistol. Grace set her suitcase down at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at the 3 of them. Dylan on the sofa, arms stretched along the back, one ankle on his knee, the king of his castle. Brittany beside him, draping herself over the armrest, like a trophy on a shelf. Margaret pouring champagne into glasses, her thin lips curved in satisfaction. 3 people celebrating the disposal of a pregnant woman. Grace walked to the door. She stopped. She didn't turn around fully, just enough so her voice would carry. "You broke the contract, Dylan. Not me. Remember that." "Get out," Dylan said. His voice was flat, bored, final. Grace opened the door. The rain hit her like a wall of cold water. October in New York was not gentle. The sky was black, the streetlights smeared into halos by the downpour, and the sidewalk was already pooling with runoff from the gutters. Grace stepped outside, one hand pulling her suitcase, the other resting on her belly. The door slammed behind her. She heard the lock click. Then, muffled through the wood and glass, she heard laughter. Grace stood on the sidewalk. The rain soaked her hair in seconds, plastering it to her skull, running in cold streams down her face and neck. Her $30 maternity dress clung to her body. Her shoes, the only pair of flats she owned, were already filling with water. To anyone watching from the windows of the neighboring brownstones, she looked exactly like what Dylan and Margaret and Brittany said she was. A discarded woman, a throwaway, a charity case who had finally outlived her usefulness. She stood there for a long moment. Then she shifted her grip on the suitcase and began to walk. She didn't hail a cab. She couldn't afford one. She walked 6 blocks through the rain to Elena Ruiz's apartment. Elena Ruiz opened her door at 10:15 on a Wednesday night and found her best friend standing in the hallway looking like something the East River had spat out. Grace was soaked from head to toe, her hair hanging in dark ropes, her maternity dress clinging to the hard, round shape of her belly. She was holding a battered suitcase in one hand and a wet check for $10,000 in the other. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry and distant, focused on something Elena couldn't see. Elena didn't ask questions. She didn't say, "Oh my God," or "What happened," or "Are you okay?" Because the answer to the last question was obviously no, and the answers to the first two were written in every line of Grace's exhausted face. Elena pulled her inside, took the suitcase, pushed her onto the couch, and wrapped her in every blanket the apartment owned. Then she made tea, put the mug in Grace's hands, and sat down across from her on the floor. "Talk when you're ready," Elena said. "Or don't talk. Either way, you're not going back out in that rain." Grace held the tea. The warmth seeped into her fingers. The baby kicked, hard, probably complaining about the cold, and Grace rubbed the spot with her palm. "He served me papers," Grace said quietly. "On our anniversary, while I was 7 months pregnant with his daughter. His mother threw away the baby's clothes. His girlfriend is redecorating the nursery." Elena's face went through about 6 different expressions in 3 seconds, the last of which settled into the cold, focused rage of a woman who was mentally constructing a to-do list that started with arson and ended with a shallow grave. "I'm going to kill him," Elena said. "No, you're not." "I'm going to kill his mother." "Elena, fine. I'm going to key his car. He'll just buy a new one." Elena clenched her jaw so hard Grace could hear her teeth creak. "What did he give you?" Grace held up the check. $10,000. Wet, wrinkled, but legible. 10,000, Elena repeated. For 5 years. For cooking, cleaning, hosting his dinner parties, managing his entire domestic life, and growing a human being inside your body. $10,000. He called it generous, Grace said. He called it generous, Elena echoed, and the way she said it made the words sound like what they actually were, which was obscene. She took a breath, visibly forcing herself to calm down. "Okay, what's the plan?" "I filed the response today. The court date is November 20th. 37 days. "And your lawyer?" Grace said nothing. "Grace, I can't afford a lawyer, Elena. Legal aid gave me forms. I filled them out myself. Elena stared at her. You're going into a divorce hearing against a senior partner at one of Manhattan's biggest law firms, and you're representing yourself? He's using 3 attorneys from his own firm, on the firm's dime. Of course he is. Elena rubbed her face with both hands. What is he asking for? Everything. The townhouse, 0 alimony, $800 a month in child support, and a waiver of all claims to his assets. His lawyers say I was voluntarily unemployed and contributed nothing to the marriage. Voluntarily unemployed? He wouldn't let you work. He told you your job was the house. I know, but I don't have that in writing. The apartment was quiet except for the rain against the window and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Elena's apartment was small. A 1-bedroom walk-up in Queens with a kitchen that was really just a corner of the living room and a bathroom where you could sit on the toilet and wash your hands in the sink at the same time. The couch Grace was sitting on would be her bed for the foreseeable future. It had a spring that poked through the left cushion, and the frame sagged in the middle, but it was warm and it was dry, and it belonged to someone who actually cared whether Grace lived or died. You can stay here as long as you need, Elena said. The couch isn't great, but the roommate is exceptional. Grace almost smiled. Almost. 3 weeks passed. Grace got her old job back at the Olympia Diner on West 46th Street, the same diner where she had worked when she met Dylan 6 years ago. He had come in one morning before a court appearance, ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin, and told her she had the most unusual eyes he had ever seen. Violet, like a character from a novel. She had blushed. She had written her number on his receipt. She had believed, with the desperate faith of a woman who had never been chosen by anyone, that this handsome, confident man with the expensive suit and the easy smile actually saw something in her worth loving. Now, she was back behind the counter, 8 months pregnant, wearing a maternity uniform that Elena had found at a consignment shop, pouring coffee for strangers and smiling through the pain in her lower back. She worked 4 shifts a week, $9.50 an hour plus tips, which on a good day came to about $60, and on a bad day came to about $30. She didn't complain. She had never complained about work. Work was clean and simple and honest. You showed up, you did the job, you got paid. It was the only transaction in Grace's life that had ever been fair. Elena watched her with growing frustration. Every night, Grace came home with swollen ankles and a brave face and a fresh stack of legal documents from Dylan's lawyers that got more aggressive with each delivery. The latest one accused Grace of intentionally becoming pregnant to extract financial support from Dylan, a claim so absurd that Elena had thrown the letter across the room and used language that would have made a dock worker blush. You have to fight, Elena said one night, sitting on the floor while Grace lay on the couch with her feet elevated on a stack of pillows. You gave that man 5 years. You cooked every meal. You cleaned every room. You hosted every dinner party. You managed his calendar, his dry cleaning, his prescriptions, his mother. That's not nothing, Grace. I don't have proof, Grace said, for the 100th time. His name is on everything. The house, the cars, the accounts. I was a ghost in that marriage, Elena. I existed to make his life easier, and I did it so well that there's no record I was ever there. She turned the locket over in her fingers. She did this often, running her thumb across the engraving, tracing the shape of the bird and the 3 initials, WRB. It was a nervous habit, like a rosary. The locket was old, heavy, made of a metal that never tarnished. It was the only thing she had from her parents, the parents she had never known, whose faces she had memorized from a single grainy photograph, and whose story she had been told in fragments by social workers who had more important things to do than comfort one more orphan in a system full of them. The story, as Grace understood it, was simple and sad. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 6 months old. There were no relatives, no godparents, no safety net. Grace had been placed in emergency foster care and had stayed in the system until she aged out at 18. The locket and the photograph were all that survived. It was Elena who changed everything, and she did it by accident. On a Tuesday night in early November, Grace was sitting at Elena's kitchen table, filling out yet another legal form, when she noticed the locket's clasp was loose. She tried to tighten it with her fingernail, and the clasp slipped. The locket swung free and banged against the table edge. Grace caught it and examined it. No damage, but the impact had shifted something. A tiny seam she had never noticed before was now slightly visible along the edge. "Is that thing broken?" Elena asked, looking up from her phone. "No, I think it opens." Grace pressed into the seam with her thumbnail. The locket popped open. Inside, on the left, was a miniature photograph, so small she had to squint. It showed a young couple, the same couple from Grace's larger photograph, holding a baby. On the right side, engraved into the platinum, in tiny, precise letters, were words. "For our Grace Eleanor, the world was dark until you arrived. Love, always. R. and M. Bennett." Grace stared at the engraving. Bennett. Her parents' name was Bennett. She had never known their last name. No one had ever told her. The foster care records listed her as Grace Miller, the name given to her by her first foster family. "Bennett," Grace whispered. Elena was already moving. She came around the table and looked at the engraving over Grace's shoulder. Then she looked at the initials on the back of the locket. WBWR, BWRB, Elena said. "If your dad was R. Bennett, then who's WRB?" Grace shook her head. She didn't know. "Give me 20 minutes, Elena said, and pulled her laptop across the table. It took her 12. Elena typed WRB Bennett into Google. The first page of results was useless, random businesses, and LinkedIn profiles. She refined the search, adding Geneva jeweler, because the pawnbroker Grace had visited the week before, hoping the locket might be worth enough to pay for a lawyer, had told her the engraving style was from a specific Swiss jeweler who served only a handful of ultra-wealthy families. The third result was a Forbes article from 20 years ago. Elena clicked it. The headline filled the screen. William Russell Bennett, the reclusive billionaire who lost everything that mattered. The article told the story of a man named William Bennett, a technology and real estate titan who had built a $14 billion empire from a single patent he filed in his garage in 1972. He was described as brilliant, ruthless in business, and fiercely private. He had one son, Robert Michael Bennett, and Robert's wife, Maria. In 1999, Robert and Maria were killed in a car accident on the Taconic State Parkway in upstate New York. Their daughter, an infant only 6 months old, survived the crash. She was pulled from the wreckage by paramedics and taken to a hospital. And then, through what the article described as a catastrophic, bureaucratic failure involving misfiled paperwork and an overwhelmed child services department, the baby disappeared into the foster care system. She was given a new name by her first foster family. Her connection to the Bennett family was lost. William Bennett had spent the next 25 years and, according to the article, over $40 million searching for her. He had hired private investigators, forensic genealogists, and data analysts. He had petitioned courts, filed Freedom of Information requests, and personally visited over 300 foster homes across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. He had never stopped. The article included photographs. One was of William Bennett, silver-haired and granite-faced, standing outside a courthouse. The other was of his son, Robert Bennett. Grace looked at the photo of Robert Bennett, and the room tilted. It was like looking in a mirror. The same jawline, the same cheekbones, and the eyes. The exact same violet eyes that Grace saw every morning when she looked at her own reflection. Her hands were shaking so badly the laptop screen blurred. "Elena," she whispered. Elena was already reading. Her mouth was open. "Grace, William Russell Bennett, WRB, your locket, your eyes. The baby in the car accident." Elena turned to her. "Grace, you're his granddaughter." "That's not possible. That's a billionaire. I'm a waitress sleeping on your couch." "Your parents were Robert and Maria Bennett. R and M Bennett. That's what the locket says. Grace Eleanor. That's your name. Your real name." Grace sat perfectly still. The baby kicked. Once, twice, 3 times, like a tiny fist knocking on a door. I can't just call a billionaire and say I'm your granddaughter. He'll think I'm a con artist. He'll think I'm insane." Elena picked up her phone. "You're not calling anybody. I am." "Elena? No." "Grace, you are 8 months pregnant, sleeping on a couch with a broken spring, working double shifts at a diner for tips, and going into a courtroom in 16 days against 3 lawyers who want to take everything from you, including your baby. If there is even a 1% chance that this man is your family, I'm making the call. You can yell at me later." Elena called the Bennett Foundation's public information line. She got a recorded message. She left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes and included the words, "Platinum locket, violet eyes, car accident, 1999, and I swear on my life, this is not a scam." Then she hung up, poured 2 glasses of water, because Grace couldn't have wine, and said, "Now we wait." They didn't wait long. 48 hours later, at 7 in the evening, there was a knock on Elena's apartment door. Not a casual knock. 3 firm, measured raps, the kind of knock that cost $500 an hour. Grace opened the door. A man stood in the hallway. He was tall, silver-haired, and wearing a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it could have been sewn directly onto his body. Behind him stood 2 other men in dark suits, hands clasped in front of them, with earpieces and the particular stillness of professional security. "My name is Sebastian Cole," the man said. His voice was precise, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years choosing his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. "I am the personal attorney and legal representative of William Russell Bennett. May I come in?" Grace stepped aside. Sebastian walked in. He took 2 steps into Elena's tiny apartment, and then he stopped. He was looking at Grace's face. Specifically, he was looking at her eyes. Sebastian Cole had been William Bennett's lawyer for 31 years. He had been present the day Robert Bennett was born. He had been present the day Robert married Maria. He had been present at the crash site, standing in the rain, watching them pull a screaming baby from the wreckage. He had spent 25 years helping William search for that baby. He was looking at the baby now. She was 32 years old, 8 months pregnant, standing in a walk-up apartment in Queens, with bags under her eyes and a locket around her neck. Sebastian's composure cracked. Just for a second. His hand, the hand that had signed 10,000 contracts without a tremor, shook. He blinked rapidly. He cleared his throat. "Miss Miller," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "We received your friend's message. We ran a DNA comparison this morning using samples from our records against biological material provided to us by your foster care agency. He paused. You are Grace Eleanor Bennett. You are the biological granddaughter of William Russell Bennett. You are the sole surviving heir to the Bennett family estate. Grace sat down on the couch, not because she chose to, because her legs stopped working. Elena grabbed the kitchen counter. Grace's hand went to her belly. The baby kicked. I don't want money, Grace said. The words came out before she could think about them, before she could calculate or strategize or be anything other than exactly who she was, a woman who had been alone her entire life and wanted only one thing from the universe. I just want to know if I have a family. Sebastian's eyes changed. The professional mask softened into something deeply, painfully human. You have a grandfather, Sebastian said quietly, who has not stopped searching for you since the day you disappeared. He is downstairs in the car right now. He has been sitting there for 20 minutes. He was afraid to come up. Afraid of what? Afraid you wouldn't want to see him. Grace looked at Elena. Elena was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, one hand over her mouth. Grace looked back at Sebastian. Send him up. William Russell Bennett climbed 4 flights of stairs in a walk-up apartment building in Queens, and by the time he reached Elena's door, he was breathing hard. Not because he was out of shape. The man still played tennis 3 times a week at 78, but because his heart was doing something it hadn't done in 25 years. It was hoping. He had trained himself out of hope a long time ago. Hope was a cruel drug for a man who had spent a quarter century searching for a ghost. Every lead that went cold, every DNA test that came back negative, every private investigator who called with regret in their voice, each one had chipped away at the reservoir of hope until William had learned to function without it. He ran his empire on discipline, his household on routine, and his emotional life on the grim acceptance that he might die without ever finding his granddaughter. And then Sebastian had called him. We found her, sir. 3 words that cracked the dam. William stood in the doorway of Elena's apartment. He was tall, still broad in the shoulders, with thick silver hair and a face that belonged on a coin. He was wearing a navy suit that cost more than the apartment's annual rent, and he was holding his hands together in front of him to stop them from shaking. He saw Grace. She was sitting on the couch, small and tired, and enormously pregnant, with dark hair and a face that made William's breath catch in his throat because it was his son's face. The jawline, the cheekbones, the quiet composure. But the eyes. God, the eyes, violet. Deep, unmistakable violet. The Bennett eyes. His wife had them, his son had them, and now this woman, this stranger who was not a stranger, this ghost who was suddenly, miraculously, terrifyingly real, she had them too. William opened his mouth to say something. He had rehearsed a speech in the car, something dignified and measured, something a billionaire would say to a granddaughter he was meeting for the first time. He had practiced it twice. He remembered none of it. He opened his arms. Grace stood up. It took her a moment because of the belly, and Elena almost moved to help her but stopped herself. Grace crossed the room. She was shaking. William was shaking. The distance between them was 8 feet and 25 years. Grace walked into his arms. William closed them around her, carefully because of the baby, and he held her. He held his son's daughter. He held the infant he had last seen being carried out of a wrecked car on a rainy highway. He held the girl he had searched for across 6 states and 2 decades and $40 million and 1,000 sleepless nights. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His chin trembled. His eyes filled. A sound came out of him that he had never made before. Not a sob exactly, but the sound of something that had been locked for 25 years finally breaking open. Grace was crying. She pressed her face into his chest, and she cried in a way she hadn't cried since she was a child in a foster home, pressing her face into a pillow so the other kids wouldn't hear. She cried for every birthday no one came to, every school play no one watched. Every night she lay in a strange bed in a strange house and whispered, "Please, someone, find me." Elena was crying in the kitchen, making no effort to hide it, tears dripping off her chin onto the linoleum. Sebastian stood in the hallway, one hand on the doorframe, looking at the ceiling with the focused intensity of a man who was absolutely not going to cry in front of anyone, his jaw working, his eyes suspiciously bright. William pulled back. He kept his hands on Grace's shoulders. He looked at her face, memorizing every detail. "You look like him," William said. His voice was rough. "You look exactly like my Robert." Grace wiped her eyes. "I have a picture. It's all I've had." I know, sweetheart. But you have more now." William looked down at her belly. His expression changed. The grief and tenderness shifted, and something new entered his eyes. Wonder. Fierce and almost painful. "Is that my great-grandchild?" Grace nodded. She took his hand and placed it on the curve of her belly. The baby, as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if she somehow knew that a large, warm hand now resting on the wall of her world belonged to someone important, kicked directly into William's palm. William's face broke open. The billionaire, the titan, the man who had stared down corporate raiders and congressional committees, came completely undone. Tears ran freely down his lined face. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your great-grandfather. I've been waiting a very long time to meet your family." Then the warmth left his face. It didn't disappear. It retreated, like the tide pulling back before a wave. What replaced it was something much older and much more dangerous. It was the face of the man who had built $14 billion from nothing. The face of a man who did not tolerate cruelty toward the people he loved. "Grace," William said, still holding her hands, "Sebastian told me some of what happened. I need you to tell me the rest. All of it." Grace told him. She told him about Dylan, about the 5 years of marriage that had really been 5 years of servitude, about the controlling of money, the isolation from friends, the daily erosion of her self-worth through comments so casual and so constant that she had stopped recognizing them as cruelty and started accepting them as fact. She told him about the anniversary dinner nobody ate, the envelope on the sonogram, the $10,000 and the order to leave, tonight, in the rain, 7 months pregnant. She told him about Margaret, about the champagne and the boxes, about the nursery, about the baby clothes in the trash bag. She told him about Brittany, the red dress, the smirk, the fresh start. William listened without interrupting. His face didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. He sat perfectly still on Elena's second-hand armchair, his hands on his knees, and he absorbed every word the way the earth absorbs lightning, silently, completely, and with the full understanding that something was about to catch fire. When Grace finished, the apartment was very quiet. William stood up. He buttoned his jacket. It was a small gesture, mechanical, but Grace saw it for what it was. It was a man putting on his armor. "Sebastian," William said. Sebastian stepped into the room. "Call the team. Every single one of them. I don't care if they're asleep, on vacation, or in another country. I want to know everything about Dylan Crawford. Every deal, every dollar, every lie. I want forensic accountants on his firm's books by tomorrow morning. I want a background check so thorough that I know what he ate for breakfast on his 10th birthday, and I want a seat in that courtroom on November 20th. Yes, sir. And the firm itself? Crawford and Mercer? William looked at Grace. Then he looked back at Sebastian. Buy it. Sebastian's eyebrow rose by exactly 1 millimeter, which for him was the equivalent of falling off his chair. All of it? All of it. Buy the firm, buy the building, buy the parking lot underneath it. I want to own the ground that man walks on before he walks into that courtroom and tries to take my granddaughter's child. Sebastian nodded. He pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway. Grace could hear him speaking in low, rapid tones, the sound of a machine being started. William turned to Grace. The iron in his face softened. Pack your things, sweetheart. You and your friend are coming with me. There's a penthouse on Central Park West with your name on the deed. There's a doctor who specializes in high-risk pregnancies waiting to see you tomorrow morning. And there is a legal team that is going to make sure that the man who threw you into the rain never has the power to hurt you or your daughter again. Grace looked at Elena. Elena was leaning against the kitchen counter, mascara streaked, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a woman who had just watched her best friend's life change in real time. I'm getting my coat, Elena said. Grace moved into the Bennett penthouse the next day. It occupied the entire top floor of a building on Central Park West, 62 stories above Manhattan, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the park and the skyline beyond. Grace's suite had a bedroom larger than Elena's entire apartment, a bathroom with heated floors, and a closet that was currently empty because Grace owned 3 changes of clothes and a maternity uniform. She stood in the middle of the bedroom on her first night, bare feet on the marble floor, and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, in the townhouse she had maintained for 5 years, Dylan was sleeping next to Brittany and dreaming of a courthouse victory. He had no idea that the woman he had thrown away had just been claimed by a force he couldn't comprehend. Grace put her hand on the window. The glass was cold. The city glittered. I don't want to destroy him, she said. William, standing in the doorway behind her, said nothing for a moment. Then he walked up beside her and looked out at the same view. I know you don't, he said. And that's why I love you already. You have your father's heart, he paused. But I'm going to make sure he can never hurt you again. That's not revenge, Grace. That's a grandfather's job. He kissed her forehead and left her alone with the skyline. That night, Grace lay in a bed that was softer than anything she had ever touched and stared at the ceiling. The baby was restless, kicking and turning, keeping her awake. She rubbed her belly in slow circles. It's going to be okay, Lily, she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken the name out loud. She had been carrying it in her heart for months, afraid to say it, as if naming the baby would make the loss harder if Dylan took everything. But Dylan wasn't going to take anything. It's going to be okay. The next 19 days moved like a military campaign. Sebastian Cole operated from a war room on the 48th floor of the Bennett Global Tower on Park Avenue. The room had originally been designed as a conference space for corporate acquisitions. It had a long mahogany table, 6 large monitors on the walls, and a coffee machine that ran 24 hours a day. Sebastian filled the room with the best legal and financial minds money could buy, and then he pointed them at Dylan Crawford like a cannon. The first order of business was the acquisition of Crawford and Mercer. This was accomplished in 72 hours through a series of shell companies and blind trusts, all perfectly legal, all designed to ensure that Dylan would have no idea his firm had changed hands until the moment it was most useful for him to find out. Bennett Capital Partners, a subsidiary of the Bennett Family Trust, acquired 51% of the firm's equity. The remaining minority partners, when approached with a buyout offer that was 30% above market value, signed with enthusiasm and discretion. Sebastian added a standard non-disclosure clause. Nobody talked. The second order of business was the forensic audit. Sebastian brought in a team of 6 forensic accountants from a firm that specialized in white-collar crime investigations. They were given unrestricted access to Crawford and Mercer's financial records, which, as the firm's new majority owner, Bennett Capital was legally entitled to review. What they found made Sebastian's blood pressure rise and his smile widen simultaneously. Dylan Crawford had been stealing from his own clients for 3 years. The scheme was not sophisticated. It was the financial equivalent of a smash and grab, relying not on cleverness, but on the assumption that no one was watching. Dylan had created a shell company called Crawford Solutions, registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, and listed it as an outside consulting firm on the books of several major client accounts. Each month, Crawford Solutions invoiced between $40,000 and $60,000 for consulting services. The invoices were approved by Dylan and paid from client funds. The sole employee of Crawford Solutions was Brittany Voss, who had no degree, no professional certifications, and listed her primary occupation on social media as lifestyle influencer. In 3 years, Dylan had siphoned $2.3 million through this scheme. The money had paid for Brittany's apartment, her car, her wardrobe, her weekly spa treatments, and a vacation to St. Bart's that Dylan had told Grace was a business trip. The forensic team also found evidence of insider trading. Dylan had purchased stock in a company called Tech Core Dynamics 3 days before Crawford and Mercer's client, Voss Industries, announced a merger with TechCore. The stock tripled in value. Dylan made $420,000 in a single trade, which he routed through an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The trade was so brazen that the only explanation for why he hadn't been caught was that no one had ever bothered to look. The third order of business was Margaret. Sebastian's investigators discovered that Margaret Crawford had retained a private investigator named Curtis Webb, paying him $15,000 in cash to fabricate a psychiatric evaluation of Grace. The fake document claimed that Grace had been involuntarily committed to a facility called the Greenfield Psychiatric Center in Albany, New York, at the age of 16, diagnosed with severe personality disorder and deemed a potential risk to herself and others. Every word of it was fiction. Grace had never been to Albany. The Greenfield Psychiatric Center had closed in 1997, 4 years before the date on the fabricated evaluation. The doctor whose name appeared on the signature line, a Dr. Raymond Foster, had never been licensed to practice medicine in any state. Curtis Webb had created him from whole cloth. Sebastian's response to this discovery was to do nothing. He did not alert the authorities. He did not file a complaint. He did not warn Margaret Crawford. Instead, he carefully documented every detail, obtained a sworn affidavit from Curtis Webb, who was more than happy to cooperate once Sebastian's lawyers explained the difference between immunity and a prison cell, and he waited. He wanted Margaret to file the document in court. He wanted her to put it in a judge's hands. And then he wanted to detonate it in front of her. Sebastian was, at heart, a patient man. While the legal and financial machinery churned, Grace lived a life she had never imagined. She woke each morning in a warm bed. She ate breakfast at a table where no one criticized her cooking. She saw Dr. Patricia Weston, one of Manhattan's leading obstetricians, who monitored Grace's blood pressure, checked the baby's growth, and told her that her daughter was healthy, active, and apparently fond of kicking her mother's bladder at 3 in the morning. Grace spent her days with William. They talked for hours. He told her about her father, about Robert's laugh, his love of old movies, his terrible cooking, his stubborn insistence on fixing things himself, even though he could afford to hire anyone. He told her about her mother, Maria, who had been a cellist with the New York Philharmonic, who had once played an entire concerto with a broken finger because she didn't want to let the orchestra down. Grace listened to these stories the way a person dying of thirst listens to the sound of water. She drank them in. She held them. She replayed them at night while lying in bed, building a picture of the parents she had never known from the fragments William gave her. William, in turn, listened to Grace. She told him about the foster homes, about the good ones, where the families were kind but overwhelmed, and about the bad ones, where she had learned to sleep with one eye open and keep her belongings in her shoes so no one could steal them. She told him about aging out of the system at 18, about the apartment above the laundromat that she shared with two other girls, about the series of waitressing jobs that led to the Olympia Diner where she met Dylan. "I thought he loved me," Grace said one evening, sitting with William in the penthouse library. "Nobody had ever chosen me before. Nobody had ever looked at me and said, 'I want you.' When he proposed, I thought it was a miracle. I thought someone had finally seen me." William was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He didn't see you, Grace. He saw an opportunity. There's a difference. I know that now. Good, because what's about to happen in that courtroom is going to change everything. And I need you to know, not believe, not hope, know that you deserve every bit of it." Grace touched her locket. "I'm not doing this for revenge. I know. You're doing it for her." He nodded at her belly. "And that's exactly right." On the evening of November 19th, the night before the hearing, Grace stood at the window of the penthouse and watched the lights of Central Park below. Elena was in the kitchen, stress-eating popcorn and reviewing the timeline Sebastian had given them. Sebastian himself had gone home at 10, which for him was early, to get what he called tactical rest. William came and stood beside Grace. "You can't sleep," he said. "No." "What are you thinking about?" Grace pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "I'm thinking about what happens when he sees me tomorrow, when he realizes what I am, what we are. Are you afraid?" "No, I'm sad." She paused. "I'm sad because I gave him 5 years and a baby, and he never once tried to know me. If he had just been kind, William, if he had just been a decent husband, he never would have lost me, and he never would have known what I was worth. He would have just had a wife who loved him, and a daughter who adored him, and a family who had his back. That's all I ever wanted to give him." William put his hand on her shoulder. "And that's more than he deserved." "Maybe, but it's what the baby deserved. A father who was present, a family that was whole." "She'll have a family," William said firmly. "She already does." Grace nodded. She touched the glass one more time. "I'm ready." Meanwhile, 12 blocks away, in the townhouse on the Upper East Side, Dylan Crawford was drinking bourbon and rehearsing his victory. He sat on the leather sofa that had replaced the one Grace had chosen. Brittany curled beside him, scrolling through furniture catalogs on her phone, and he imagined the courtroom. Grace wouldn't show up. He was almost certain. She had no lawyer, no money, and no fight in her. She had never had any fight. That was what he had loved about her, the total absence of resistance, and it was what he now despised. His lead attorney, a partner named Marcus Hale, had assured him it was a formality. If Grace failed to appear, the judge would grant a default judgment. Dylan would keep the house, pay minimal child support, and walk away clean. If she did appear, alone and unrepresented, the outcome would be the same, just with a more satisfying view. "By Thanksgiving," Dylan told Brittany, "this will all be over. You'll be Mrs. Crawford, living in the townhouse, and that waitress will be back at the diner where she belongs." Brittany smiled and showed him a photograph of a $7,000 baby crib. "I want this one, in gold." Dylan kissed her forehead. "Anything you want, babe." His phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. "I filed something extra with Marcus. A psychiatric evaluation showing she's unfit." The judge will see she's mentally unstable. We can push for full custody. Dylan stared at the text. Full custody. He didn't want custody. He didn't want the baby at all. The baby was an inconvenience, a biological accident he wished Grace had handled quietly. But custody was leverage. If they could threaten to take the baby, Grace would surrender everything else to get her back. It was a negotiating tactic, the same kind he used in corporate mergers. Apply pressure to the emotional center and watch the opposition collapse. Dylan typed back a single word. Good. He turned off his phone, finished his drink, and went to bed. He slept soundly. He dreamed of winning. He had no idea that 20 blocks north, in a penthouse that overlooked the same city, an army was polishing its weapons and waiting for dawn. November 20th, Manhattan Family Court. The building squatted on Center Street like a gray concrete headstone, its facade streaked with decades of rain and exhaust. Inside, the hallways smelled like floor wax and anxiety. It was the kind of building where lives were rearranged on a daily basis. Marriages dissolved, children's fates decided, fortunes divided, all of it processed through wood-paneled courtrooms by judges who had seen so much human misery that they could identify the liars before the first witness was sworn. Dylan Crawford arrived at 8:45 in a black Lincoln town car. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal Brioni that he had bought with money siphoned from a client account, though he would never have described it that way. His hair was freshly cut. His shoes were polished to a military shine. He carried a leather briefcase he didn't need because his lawyers carried the real documents, but it made him feel important, and feeling important was essential to Dylan's emotional survival. Margaret Crawford sat beside him in the car. She was wearing a navy suit with pearl earrings and a thin, satisfied smile. She carried a leather folder in her lap, inside which was the psychiatric evaluation she had paid Curtis Webb $15,000 to fabricate. Remember, Margaret said as they approached the courthouse, if she shows up, which she won't, let Marcus handle it. You just sit there and look like the responsible parent. She's not going to show up, Mom. Of course she isn't. Where would she even get the subway fare? They both laughed. It was a dry, joyless sound, like two rattlesnakes comparing notes. Dylan's legal team was already inside. Marcus Hale, lead attorney, along with two junior associates from Crawford and Mercer, were setting up at the respondents' table. They had a stack of documents, several legal pads, and the serene confidence of men who expected to win by default. Dylan entered the courtroom. It was smaller than he expected, wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, with rows of hard wooden benches for observers. Judge Patricia Holloway's nameplate was on the bench. Dylan didn't know much about her, but Marcus had briefed him. Experienced, fair, by the book. Not the kind of judge who would be swayed by emotion. Perfect. Dylan sat down. He looked at the plaintiff's table. It was empty. He checked his watch. 8:50, empty. 8:53, empty. A small, warm flame of triumph ignited in Dylan's chest. She wasn't coming. Grace, the quiet, obedient, invisible Grace, had done exactly what he expected her to do. She had accepted her fate. She had taken the $10,000 and crawled back to whatever hole she had come from. Marcus leaned over. If she's not here by 9, I'll move for a default judgment. The judge will grant everything. Full terms. Dylan nodded. He pulled out his phone under the table and texted Brittany. She's not coming. We won. Champagne tonight. Brittany texted back a champagne emoji and a heart. Margaret, sitting in the front row of the gallery, crossed her ankles and folded her hands in her lap. She was already composing the text she would send to her bridge club. 8:56. The plaintiff's table was still empty. 8:57. 8:58. And then the noise started. It came from outside, filtering through the courtroom's heavy doors and narrow windows. A commotion in the hallway. Raised voices. The squawk of walkie-talkies. The heavy, synchronized footsteps of people who moved in formation. Dylan looked at Marcus. Marcus frowned. One of the junior associates stood up and cracked open the courtroom door to look. He went pale and sat back down without saying a word. "What?" Dylan asked. The junior associate swallowed. There are a lot of people out there." The courtroom doors opened. Not tentatively, not one at a time, but both doors, pushed open simultaneously by two men in dark suits with earpieces and the particular body language of professional security. They didn't enter the courtroom. They held the doors and stood aside. Sebastian Cole walked in first. Silver hair, charcoal suit, the thin gold pin of the New York State Bar on his lapel. He carried a single leather briefcase, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never lost a case he cared about. Behind him walked four more attorneys, two men and two women, each carrying document cases, each radiating the focused calm of a surgical team entering an operating room. Dylan stared. 5 lawyers. Who hires 5 lawyers for a family court divorce? Behind the attorneys came a man. He was older, late 70s, tall and straight-backed, with silver hair and a face that radiated power the way a furnace radiates heat. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Dylan's car. He walked slowly, not out of frailty, but out of gravity. Each step deliberate, each movement carrying the weight of a man who is accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. Dylan didn't recognize him, but something about the man made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. And then Grace walked in. Dylan's breath stopped, not figuratively. His diaphragm actually seized, his lungs locked, and for 3 full seconds, he did not breathe. She was unrecognizable. The woman walking into the courtroom was not the woman he had thrown into the rain 5 weeks ago. That woman had been small, gray, invisible, exactly as he had made her. This woman was something else entirely. Grace was wearing a fitted, navy blue maternity dress custom-tailored to her 8-month frame that managed to be both elegant and powerful. Her hair was swept up in a twist that Elena had spent 40 minutes perfecting that morning. She wore minimal makeup. She didn't need it. Her skin glowed with the particular luminance of late pregnancy, and her eyes, those violet eyes that Dylan had once called unusual and then spent 5 years ignoring, were clear and steady and absolutely lethal. Around her neck, the platinum locket gleamed against the dark fabric of her dress. It was the same locket, but it looked different now, polished, restored, and hanging on a new chain of white gold that caught the fluorescent light and turned it into something that looked almost absurdly like a crown. Grace walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. She didn't look left. She didn't look right. She didn't look at Dylan. She walked to the plaintiff's table, pulled out her chair, and sat down. Sebastian sat beside her. The 4 attorneys arranged themselves behind. William Bennett took a seat directly behind Grace in the first row of the gallery, where Dylan could see him clearly, where the message was impossible to miss. "She is mine. You had your chance, and you broke her. Now try to get past me." Elena slid into a seat 2 rows back. She was wearing the nicest outfit she owned, a black blazer and slacks she had borrowed from a friend, and she was gripping her own hands in her lap so tightly her knuckles were white. But she was there. She had been there since the beginning, and she would be there until the end. Dylan stared at Grace. His brain was trying to process what his eyes were showing him, and the math wasn't working. Grace was poor. Grace was alone. Grace had no one. Grace was a waitress who wore Target dresses and cut coupons and couldn't afford a lawyer. So why was she sitting there with 5 attorneys, a security detail, and a man who looked like he could buy the courthouse and turn it into a parking garage? Margaret leaned forward from the gallery and whispered urgently through the railing. Dylan, who are those people? Dylan didn't answer. He couldn't. He was looking at the briefcase Sebastian had set on the table. Embossed on the leather, in gold, was a crest. A double-headed hawk clutching a sword. The same symbol on Grace's locket. The same symbol he had seen on that locket 1,000 times and dismissed as costume jewelry decoration. The same symbol that had been on the memo from the new owners of his firm. The memo he had glanced at 2 weeks ago and ignored because he assumed the new ownership was some faceless investment fund that would never affect him. His blood went cold. And then Grace turned her head, just slightly, just enough so that her eyes met his for the first time since the night she walked out of their home in the rain. She didn't glare. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She looked at him the way you look at a chapter you've already finished reading. Closed, done, past tense. Then she turned back to face the judge's bench, and Dylan Crawford sat at the defendant's table, feeling something he had never felt in his entire adult life. He felt small. Judge Patricia Holloway entered the courtroom at exactly 9:03. She was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the kind of face that suggested she had heard every lie ever invented and was not in the mood to hear a new one. She sat, arranged her papers, and looked out at the courtroom. Her eyes paused briefly on the plaintiff's side, noting the 5 attorneys, the security detail seated in the gallery, and the silver-haired man who looked like he could buy the building. Then she looked at the defendant's side. 3 attorneys from what her docket sheet told her was the respondent's own law firm, the respondent himself, and an older woman in pearls sitting behind him with the expression of someone who had just bitten into a lemon. "This is the matter of Crawford versus Crawford," the judge said. "Dissolution of marriage, custody determination, and division of assets. Counsel, identify yourselves for the record." Marcus Hale stood. Marcus Hale of Crawford and Mercer, representing the respondent, Dylan Crawford. Sebastian Cole stood. He buttoned his jacket. He did it slowly. Sebastian Cole of the Bennett Law Group, representing the petitioner, Grace Eleanor Bennett Crawford. Marcus blinked. "Bennett?" Sebastian didn't look at him. The petitioner was born Grace Eleanor Bennett. She was separated from her family as an infant and raised in the foster care system under the name Grace Miller. Her identity has been confirmed through DNA analysis. She is the sole surviving granddaughter of William Russell Bennett. The courtroom went very quiet. Marcus turned to Dylan. Dylan was gripping the edge of the table. His face had gone the color of old paper. Judge Holloway looked at Sebastian over her reading glasses. "Mr. Cole, is the gentleman in the gallery William Bennett?" "He is, Your Honor." The judge absorbed this with the professional calm of a woman who had presided over cases involving celebrities, politicians, and organized crime figures. She turned to Marcus. "Proceed with your opening, Mr. Hale." Marcus stood up. He had prepared a speech about Dylan's contributions to the marriage, Grace's lack of income, and the equitable distribution of assets in the respondent's favor. It was a good speech. He had practiced it in the mirror. It assumed that Grace would be sitting alone at the other table, frightened and unrepresented. Looking at the wall of legal talent facing him, Marcus felt the speech wilting in his throat like a flower in a furnace, but he was a professional. He delivered it. "Your Honor, my client, Dylan Crawford, is a senior partner at one of Manhattan's most respected law firms. He has been the sole financial provider for this family for the entirety of the marriage. Mrs. Crawford, or Ms. Bennett, as she now prefers, was voluntarily unemployed throughout the marriage. She brought no assets into the union and generated no income during its duration. We are requesting full ownership of the marital residence, minimal child support consistent with the petitioner's earning capacity, and no spousal maintenance. He sat down. Sebastian stood. He did not rush. He adjusted his cuffs. He looked at the judge. Your Honor, before we proceed with the standard matters of this dissolution, I would like to enter several items into evidence that fundamentally alter the nature and scope of this case. These items pertain to the respondent's financial conduct, his treatment of the petitioner, and the fitness of his household to maintain custody of the minor child. The judge nodded. Proceed, Mr. Cole. Sebastian opened his briefcase. The first document was thick, bound, and tabbed with colored markers. He handed copies to the judge, to Marcus, and to the court clerk. This is the result of a forensic audit conducted on the financial records of Crawford and Mercer, specifically the accounts managed or accessed by Dylan Crawford over the past 3 years. This audit was conducted at the request of the firm's majority shareholder, Bennett Capital Partners, which acquired controlling interest in Crawford and Mercer on November 1st of this year. Marcus shot to his feet. Objection. We were not notified of any change in ownership. The acquisition was conducted under standard non-disclosure provisions, Sebastian said calmly. All parties were bound by confidentiality until the transaction was complete. Your firm's minority partners signed willingly. The records in question are the legal property of Bennett Capital Partners, and their review is entirely within the rights of the new ownership. Judge Holloway looked at Marcus. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Cole. Sebastian turned a page. He spoke clearly, his voice pitched to carry, every word landing like a stone dropped into still water. Over the past 36 months, Mr. Crawford created and operated a shell company called Crawford Solutions, registered to a post office box in Delaware. This company was listed as an outside consulting firm on the books of multiple client accounts handled by Mr. Crawford at the firm. Each month, Crawford Solutions submitted invoices ranging from $40,000 to $60,000 for consulting services that were never performed. These invoices were approved by Mr. Crawford and paid from client funds. Dylan stood up. Those are privileged firm records. You can't... Sit down, Mr. Crawford, Judge Holloway said sharply. You'll have your opportunity to respond. Dylan sat. His face was the color of wet cement. Sebastian continued. The sole listed employee of Crawford Solutions is Brittany Voss, who has no professional degree, no consulting certification, and whose publicly listed occupation is, and I quote, lifestyle influencer. He paused to let the courtroom absorb this. Over 3 years, Mr. Crawford diverted approximately $2.3 million from client accounts through this scheme. The funds were used to finance Miss Voss's apartment, vehicle, wardrobe, personal expenses, and a vacation to the Caribbean, which Mr. Crawford told his pregnant wife was a business trip. Sebastian set down the first document and picked up a second. Additionally, the audit revealed that Mr. Crawford purchased stock in a company called TechCore Dynamics 3 days before his firm's client, Voss Industries, announced a merger with TechCore. The stock tripled in value. Mr. Crawford's profit from this single insider trade was $420,000, routed through an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He set this document down as well. To summarize, Your Honor, while Mrs. Crawford was wearing shoes with holes in the soles, working as a waitress at 8 months pregnant to afford basic necessities, her husband was stealing millions from his own clients to finance his mistress's lifestyle and committing securities fraud. We believe these facts are relevant to the court's determination of asset division, spousal support, and the character of the respondent. The courtroom was so silent that Grace could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Judge Holloway looked at Dylan. "Mr. Crawford, do you wish to respond?" Dylan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Marcus grabbed his arm and whispered urgently in his ear. Dylan shook his head. "We reserve our response, Your Honor," Marcus said, and his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. Sebastian wasn't finished. "Your Honor, there is one more matter." He turned to the gallery. Margaret Crawford was sitting in the front row, her face a mask of rigid composure, though her hands were gripping her purse so tightly the leather was creasing. The respondent's mother, Margaret Crawford, has prepared a document which I believe opposing counsel intends to introduce. I would invite them to do so now. Marcus hesitated. He looked at Margaret. Margaret gave a sharp, insistent nod. Marcus reached into his file and withdrew the psychiatric evaluation. "Your Honor," Marcus said slowly, "we would like to enter into evidence a psychiatric evaluation of the petitioner conducted during her time in the foster care system, which raises questions about her fitness as a custodial parent." He handed the document to the judge. Judge Holloway reviewed it, her eyes scanning the pages. She looked up. "Mr. Cole, your response?" Sebastian stood very straight. He clasped his hands behind his back. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Your Honor, the document just entered by opposing counsel is a complete fabrication." Margaret shot forward in her seat. "That is, the doctor whose signature appears on this evaluation, a Dr. Raymond Foster, does not exist. No physician by that name has ever been licensed to practice medicine in the state of New York or in any state. The institution referenced, the Greenfield Psychiatric Center in Albany, closed permanently in 1997, 4 years before the date listed on this document." Sebastian picked up a folder from his table. "Furthermore, we have obtained a sworn affidavit from the individual who created this document, a private investigator named Curtis Webb, who was retained by Margaret Crawford and paid $15,000 in cash to fabricate this evaluation. Mr. Webb has provided a full written confession detailing Mrs. Crawford's instructions, the payment, and the creation of the fictitious Dr. Foster. This affidavit was provided in exchange for limited immunity." He placed the affidavit on the judge's bench. Margaret stood up. Her face was white. "That man is lying. I never—" "Dylan, tell them I would never—" "Ma'am, sit down immediately," Judge Holloway said. Her voice could have frozen a river. Margaret didn't sit down. She turned to Dylan, her eyes wild. "Dylan, say something. Defend me." Dylan didn't look at her. He was staring at the table in front of him, at his own hands, which were trembling. "Bailiff?" Judge Holloway said. 2 court officers approached Margaret. She tried to speak again, but the judge cut her off. "Mrs. Crawford, you are being removed from this courtroom. I am referring this document to the district attorney's office for investigation of fraud, perjury, and filing false instruments in a court proceeding. These are felony charges. I strongly advise you to retain legal counsel." Margaret's mouth opened and closed. The bailiffs each took an arm. She pulled against them, trying to turn back to Dylan. Dylan, don't let them do this. I did this for you. I did everything for you." Dylan didn't move. He didn't look up. He sat at the defendant's table and listened to his mother being escorted out of the courtroom, her voice echoing off the wood panels until the heavy doors swung shut and cut it off. The courtroom was very quiet. Sebastian delivered the final blow with the precision of a surgeon. "Your Honor, one final matter. Seated in the gallery is Ms. Rachel Torres, a representative of the New York State Bar Association's Office of Attorney Ethics. Based on the evidence of embezzlement, client, fund misappropriation, and insider trading documented in our forensic audit, the Bar Association has initiated formal disbarment proceedings against Dylan Crawford. His license to practice law in the state of New York has been suspended as of 8 o'clock this morning. Marcus Hale stood up. He adjusted his tie. He looked at Dylan with an expression that was part pity and part professional self-preservation. "Your Honor," Marcus said carefully, "at this time, counsel for the respondent is withdrawing representation. Our firm, Crawford and Mercer, has been advised by its new majority ownership that continued representation of Mr. Crawford in this matter constitutes a conflict of interest." He gathered his papers. The two junior associates gathered theirs. They walked out of the courtroom without looking at Dylan. Dylan was alone at the defendant's table. No lawyers, no mother, no firm, no license. Judge Holloway looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Grace. "Mrs. Crawford, would you like to address the court?" Grace stood. She placed both hands on the table in front of her and pushed herself up carefully, her 8-month belly shifting as she rose. She didn't move to the podium. She stood where she was, at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded over her daughter. She didn't look at Dylan. "Your Honor," Grace said. Her voice was steady, clear, not loud, not dramatic, but carrying the weight of someone who has rehearsed nothing, because the truth requires no rehearsal. 5 years ago, I married a man who told me he loved me. I believed him because I had never been loved before. I grew up in foster care. I had no family, no money, and no last name that meant anything. When Dylan proposed, I thought someone had finally seen me. I thought love meant being grateful. I thought love meant being quiet while someone slowly took everything from you and told you to say thank you." She paused. 5 weeks ago, my husband handed me divorce papers on our wedding anniversary. I was 7 months pregnant. He told me I was background noise. He gave me $10,000 and told me to leave the house that night, in the rain. His mother came to help. She went into the nursery, the room I had spent months preparing for our daughter, and she put my baby's clothes in a trash bag while I watched. Grace's voice didn't break. It didn't waver. It was the steadiest thing in the room. I didn't know who I was then. I learned, 3 weeks ago, that my parents were Robert and Maria Bennett, that my grandfather is William Bennett, that the locket I have worn every day of my life was the only thing that survived the accident that killed my parents. She touched the locket at her throat. "But I want to be clear, Your Honor. The money doesn't change what happened. Whether I am Grace Miller, the waitress, or Grace Bennett, the heiress, no woman, no pregnant woman, no human being deserves to be thrown into the rain by the person who promised to love them. The money didn't create the truth. It just made sure the truth could be heard." She sat down. The courtroom was absolutely silent for 5 seconds. Then Elena, in the back row, whispered, "That's my girl," loudly enough for everyone to hear. And nobody told her to be quiet, because nobody wanted to. Judge Patricia Holloway did not issue her ruling immediately. She retired to her chambers for 45 minutes, during which time Dylan Crawford sat alone at the defendant's table and experienced what could generously be described as a reckoning, and more accurately described as a man watching his entire identity collapse in real time. He had built his life on a simple architecture. He was the provider. He was the rescuer. He was the man who had plucked a nobody from obscurity and given her a life she could never have earned on her own. Every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every night, he came home smelling like Britney's perfume and walked past Grace without acknowledgement. All of it had been justified by this central fiction. He was the one with value. She was the one who should be grateful. And now he was sitting in a courtroom with no lawyers, no license, no firm, no mother, and the woman he had told to be grateful was sitting across the aisle backed by a legal team that could have represented a sovereign nation, and a grandfather whose net worth exceeded the GDP of several small countries. Dylan stared at the wood grain of the table. He traced the lines with his finger. He thought about the night he had thrown her out. The rain, the suitcase, the belly, the way she had stopped at the door and said, "You broke the contract, not me." He hadn't understood it then. He understood it now. The contract wasn't just the marriage. It was the basic human agreement that says when someone trusts you with their life, you don't throw it in the garbage. The judge returned. She sat. She adjusted her reading glasses. She looked first at Grace, then at Dylan. "I have reviewed the evidence presented today, the forensic audit findings, the fabricated psychiatric evaluation, and the testimony of both parties. I will now issue my rulings." She picked up her notes. First, on the matter of custody. Full legal and physical custody of the minor child is awarded to the petitioner, Grace Eleanor Bennett Crawford. The respondent, Dylan Crawford, is granted supervised visitation only, contingent upon completion of a court-approved parenting course and a psychological evaluation conducted by a licensed professional at his own expense. Until these conditions are met, no visitation will occur. Dylan closed his eyes. Second, on the matter of the marital residence. The townhouse at 447 East 73rd Street is awarded to the petitioner as marital property. The court recognizes the petitioner's substantial domestic contributions throughout the marriage, including household management, meal preparation, event hosting, and the maintenance of the property itself. The respondent's fraudulent financial conduct nullifies any equitable claim he might otherwise have asserted. Third, on the matter of financial division, the respondent's personal assets are hereby frozen, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation into embezzlement, securities fraud, and money laundering. The respondent is ordered to cooperate fully with all investigative bodies. Fourth, on the matter of child support, the respondent is ordered to pay child support in the amount of $10,000 per month. Judge Holloway looked directly at Dylan. "Mr. Crawford, you offered your pregnant wife $10,000 total and called it generous. You called it a lottery ticket. I am ordering you to pay that amount every single month for the next 18 years. Perhaps that will help you understand what generosity actually means." Fifth, on the matter of Margaret Crawford, this court is referring the matter of the fabricated psychiatric evaluation to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office for investigation of fraud, perjury, conspiracy, and the filing of false instruments in a court of law. A temporary restraining order is issued immediately, barring Margaret Crawford from contacting the petitioner or the minor child. The judge set down her papers. This marriage is dissolved. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sound like a door closing. Grace didn't move for a moment. She sat at the table, with her hands on her belly, feeling her daughter turn and kick, and she let the silence of the courtroom wash over her. Sebastian placed his hand briefly on her shoulder. "It's done," he said quietly. William was already on his feet. He came through the gallery gate and stood behind Grace's chair, one hand on her back. Grace stood. She turned toward the door, and for the first time, she looked at Dylan. He was sitting alone. His hands were flat on the table. His head was slightly bowed. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. Not the shark in the suit, not the king of his castle, just a man at a table with nothing left. Grace didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel satisfied. She felt a deep, hollow sadness, the kind that comes not from losing something, but from confirming that what you lost was never really there to begin with. She didn't speak to him. There was nothing left to say. She walked out of the courtroom. William held the door. Sebastian walked beside her. The four attorneys fell into step behind them. Elena was waiting in the hallway. She took one look at Grace's face and burst into tears, which she immediately tried to disguise as a cough, which fooled no one. You okay? Elena asked, grabbing both of Grace's hands. I'm okay. You were incredible. I told the truth. That's all? Yeah, well, the truth looked really good on you today. They walked out of the courthouse together. The November air was cold and sharp. It was raining, because of course it was raining, because the universe understood dramatic symmetry even if Dylan Crawford didn't. Grace stopped at the top of the courthouse steps. She looked out at the rain, the same kind of rain that had soaked her to the bone 5 weeks ago when she stood on a sidewalk with a suitcase and a check for $10,000 and the absolute certainty that she was worth nothing. She pulled the collar of her coat up around her neck. William opened an umbrella and held it over her. Ready to go home? He asked. Grace looked at him. She looked at Elena, who was trying to share an umbrella with Sebastian, who was enduring it with visible discomfort. She looked at the city, wet and gray and enormous, and hers. Yeah, Grace said. I'm ready. Behind them, inside the courthouse, Dylan Crawford sat alone in the empty courtroom. For a very long time, the bailiff came twice to tell him the room was needed for the next case. Dylan didn't hear him either time. Finally he stood. He buttoned his jacket by reflex, the way a soldier who has lost the war still salutes the flag. He picked up his briefcase, the one he carried because it made him feel important, and he walked out. He stood on the courthouse steps. The rain hit him immediately. He had no umbrella, he had no car waiting, he had no phone call to make, because there was no one left to call. He stood there in his expensive suit, in the rain, on the steps of a courthouse where he had just lost everything, and he looked exactly like what Grace had looked like 5 weeks ago. Invisible, alone, disposable. He started walking. In the 7 days following the court hearing, Dylan Crawford's life didn't just fall apart. It was dismantled, piece by piece, with the mechanical precision of a building being demolished by professionals who knew exactly which walls to remove first to ensure the whole structure came down clean. Brittany left first. She was waiting for him at the townhouse when he got home from court, but not in the way she used to wait for him, draped on the sofa in something expensive, scrolling her phone, ready to be admired. She was standing in the foyer, surrounded by suitcases, wearing sunglasses, even though it was 6:30 in the evening and raining outside, which was Brittany's universal signal for I have been crying and I don't want you to see the damage to my mascara. What's this? Dylan asked. Though the answer was obvious, Brittany pulled off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red, but they weren't sad. They were furious. Daddy called me from the car after the courthouse. His lawyers already got word about the audit. Do you know what he said, Dylan? He said you're radioactive. He said anyone associated with you is going to get dragged into a federal investigation. He's pulling the Voss Industries account from the firm. He can't pull the account. The firm isn't yours anymore, Dylan. Her family owns it. Did you not hear what happened in there today? Dylan set down his briefcase. Brittany, this is temporary. I can fix this. I've been in tight spots before. Brittany looked at him the way you look at a check engine light that has been on for 6 months and is now accompanied by smoke. You can't fix this, Dylan. You don't even understand what this is. Your license is gone. Your firm is gone. Your clients are gone. Your mother is going to be arrested. And now my father is going to sue you to protect himself. She zipped the last suitcase. I am not going down with this ship. What about us? What about the baby? You said you were... Brittany's face went blank. There is no baby, Dylan. There never was. Your mother made that up to hurt your wife, and I went along with it because it was funny at the time. She picked up her bags. I'm going to Miami. Daddy has a condo there. Don't call me. Brittany, please. I did all of this for you. I left Grace for you. I built Crawford Solutions for you. Brittany stopped at the door. She turned and looked at him with an expression that stripped away all the spray tan and the designer labels and revealed something underneath that was much older and much colder than 28. You didn't do anything for me, Dylan. You did it for yourself. You wanted a trophy, and I played the part because you were paying for it. But I don't stay with men who can't pay the bill. That was your ex-wife's specialty. Go find her. She paused. Oh, wait. She's a billionaire now. Good luck with that. The door closed behind her with a click that sounded permanent. 2 days later, the Financial Times published the story. The headline read, Crawford and Mercer fraud scandal. Partner embezzled millions while pregnant wife lived in poverty. The article was thorough, detailed, and devastating. It included the forensic audit findings, the shell company, the insider trading, the fabricated psychiatric evaluation, and the fact that Grace had been working as a waitress at 8 months pregnant, while Dylan funneled millions to his mistress. The Wall Street Journal ran a similar story the same day. By noon, the New York Post had picked it up, and by 3 o'clock, it was trending on every social media platform in the country. Dylan's LinkedIn connections dropped by 324 hours. His phone, which still worked, even if his life didn't, buzzed with messages from former colleagues. None of them were supportive. Most were some variation of, "Do not contact me. My lawyer has advised me to distance myself." 2 of them simply said, "Wow." The Voss Industries account was pulled from Crawford and Mercer within 48 hours of the court hearing. Richard Voss, displaying the survival instincts of a man who had built a billion-dollar company by always knowing when to change sides, issued a public statement expressing his support for Grace Bennett's newly announced foundation and pledging a $5 million donation. He did not mention his daughter. He did not mention Dylan. Margaret was arrested on a Wednesday morning, 5 days after the hearing. 2 detectives from the Manhattan DA's fraud unit knocked on the door of the townhouse where she was staying, Dylan having given her a key the week before the court date, and arrested her on charges of fraud, filing false instruments, and conspiracy to deprive a parent of custody through fraudulent means. Margaret called Dylan from the police station. He was sitting in the kitchen of the townhouse, which was nearly empty because Brittany had taken most of the furnishings, and the court order gave Grace the property. "Dylan," Margaret said. Her voice was smaller than he had ever heard it. "I need a lawyer. I don't have money for a lawyer, Mom." "Then find money. Sell something. Borrow from someone. There's no one left to borrow from." Silence on the line. "I did this for you," Margaret said. "Everything I did was for you." "I know, Mom." "Then help me." Dylan looked at the empty kitchen, at the bare walls where Brittany's decorators had removed Grace's art, and then Brittany had removed the replacements, at the coffee machine that still didn't work because neither Brittany nor Dylan nor Margaret had ever learned how to fix anything because fixing things was Grace's job. "I can't help you, Mom. I can't even help myself." He hung up. Margaret screamed his name into a dead line. Dylan received notice from the court 3 days later. He had 30 days to vacate the townhouse. The property had been awarded to Grace. He packed his belongings into a gym bag, the same type of bag Grace had carried when she left, and moved into a studio apartment in a walk-up building in the Bronx. It had one window that looked out onto a fire escape and a brick wall. The mattress was on the floor. The refrigerator hummed louder than the traffic. He sat on the mattress his first night there and stared at the ceiling. He tried to add up what he had lost. The math was staggering. The firm, the house, the car, the bank accounts, the career, the reputation, the wife, the mistress, the mother. He had started the month of October as a senior partner at a prestigious law firm with a beautiful girlfriend, a $3 million townhouse, and the unshakable belief that he was the most important person in every room he entered. He was ending November in a studio apartment with a gym bag and an instant noodle cup. He tried to call Grace. The number he had for her was disconnected. He wrote a letter and mailed it to the Bennett Global Building on Park Avenue. It came back unopened, marked "Return to Sender," in handwriting he didn't recognize. He went to the building in person. He walked through the glass revolving doors into a lobby of marble and steel and stood at the security desk. "I need to see Grace Crawford, Grace Bennett." The security guard checked his screen. "Your name?" "Dylan Crawford." The guard typed. His face didn't change. "I'm sorry, sir. You're on the restricted access list. I'm unable to allow you past this point. She's my wife. According to our records, she's your ex-wife, and you're on the restricted list. Please step away from the desk." Dylan stood in the lobby of the Bennett Global Building and looked up. The atrium rose 40 stories, all glass and light, an architectural cathedral built by a man who had turned a garage patent into an empire. Somewhere above him, on a floor he would never reach, his ex-wife, the woman he had called background noise, owned everything he could see. He walked outside. The cold hit him. He pulled his jacket tighter. It was the same jacket he had worn to court, the Brioni, the last expensive thing he owned. It still looked good, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like a costume from a play that had closed. He started walking south. He had nowhere to be all. On December 15th, at 2:17 in the morning, Grace woke up in the Bennett penthouse with a sharp pain in her lower back and a wetness on the sheets that meant it was time. She called Elena, who was sleeping in the guest room down the hall. Elena appeared in the doorway in 3 seconds, fully dressed, holding car keys, wearing sneakers. She had been sleeping in her clothes for a week, just in case. "Is it happening?" Elena asked. "It's happening." Okay. I've got the bag. I've got the car. William is going to meet us there. Sebastian has the birth certificate paperwork. I called the doctor 20 minutes ago." Grace stared at her. I just woke up. How did you call the doctor 20 minutes ago?" Elena shrugged. "I had a feeling." They drove to Mount Sinai Hospital in a Bennett family car, Elena behind the wheel, Grace in the back seat breathing through contractions that came every 7 minutes, and then every 5 and then every 3 by the time they reached the emergency entrance. William arrived 12 minutes later. He had been awake, as he had been most nights since Grace moved in, sitting in his study reading and waiting for this exact phone call. He walked into the hospital wearing a suit because William Bennett had not worn anything less formal than business casual since 1986. And he stationed himself in the waiting room like a general overseeing a siege. Sebastian arrived 20 minutes after that, carrying a leather folder of legal documents and a stuffed elephant he had purchased from the hospital gift shop, which was the most human thing anyone had ever seen him do. The delivery took 6 hours. Grace was brave and focused and profane, the last quality being something Elena took full credit for, and at 3:47 in the morning, Lily Grace Bennett entered the world. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, 10 fingers, 10 toes, a full head of dark hair, and when she opened her eyes for the first time, blinking against the fluorescent lights of the delivery room, the doctor paused. "Well," Dr. Weston said, smiling, "she has your eyes. Violet. Deep, unmistakable violet." The Bennett eyes, passed down through 3 generations. Grace held her daughter. She looked at the tiny face, the miniature hands that gripped her index finger with a strength that seemed impossible for something so small. She felt the weight of her, warm and real, and finally here, this person she had been carrying through the worst months of her life, this person who had kicked her through every insult and every sleepless night, and every mile of sidewalk walked in the rain. "Hi, Lily," Grace whispered. "I'm your mom, and I promise you, you are never going to wonder if you're wanted, not for a single day of your life." William came in 20 minutes later, after Grace had been moved to a private room. Elena went to get at him from the waiting room and found him sitting in a plastic chair, staring at the wall with the expression of a man who is trying very hard not to have emotions in a public space. "You can come in now," Elena said. William stood. He straightened his tie. He walked into the room with his hands behind his back, and then he saw Lily, and everything he had built in 78 years of discipline and composure fell apart. Grace held the baby out to him. "Would you like to hold your great-granddaughter?" William took Lily with hands that trembled but held firm. He cradled her against his chest, this tiny, sleeping person who weighed less than his briefcase, and tears ran down his face without permission or apology. "You look like your father," he whispered to Lily. "You look just like my Robert, and you have no idea how long I've been waiting for you." He stood there for a long time, holding the baby, and nobody in the room said anything because some moments are too full for words. Elena took approximately 400 photographs. She would later claim the number was lower, but her phone's camera roll told a different story. Sebastian stood in the doorway, holding the stuffed elephant and looking at the ceiling with extreme concentration. Later that morning, a news alert appeared on every major media outlet in the city. "Bennett Harris welcomes baby girl." The article included a single photograph released by the Bennett family press office showing Grace in the hospital bed holding Lily with William standing beside her. Grace was smiling. Lily was sleeping. William was looking at both of them with an expression that contained 25 years of grief and loss transmuted into something that looked, improbably and beautifully, like joy. Dylan saw the article on his phone. He was sitting alone in his studio apartment in the Bronx, eating instant ramen from the pot because he didn't own a bowl. The notification popped up on his screen, and he tapped it without thinking. He looked at the photograph for a very long time. He looked at Grace, glowing and surrounded by people who loved her. He looked at William, the grandfather whose existence Dylan had never suspected. And he looked at Lily, his daughter, who had his dark hair and the Bennett violet eyes, and who would grow up in a penthouse on Central Park West knowing she was wanted, knowing she was loved, knowing she belonged. He looked at the photo, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like a blade, exactly what he had thrown away. Not a waitress, not a housekeeper, not background noise, a woman who would have loved him if he had let her, a daughter who would have adored him if he had stayed, a family that would have been his if he had simply been kind. He put the phone face down on the mattress. He sat in the silence of his empty apartment. He didn't cry. He was past crying. He just sat there. And the silence sat with him, and neither of them had anything left to say. October 14th, what would have been their 6th wedding anniversary. Grace stood on the terrace of the Bennett penthouse, 62 stories above Manhattan, and watched the sun set over Central Park. The trees were in full autumn color, red and gold and amber, and the late afternoon light turned the city into something that looked almost gentle. Lily was on her hip, 1 year old, babbling a continuous stream of sounds that were almost but not quite words. She was wearing a white dress and tiny shoes that she kept trying to kick off, and she was grabbing at Grace's locket with chubby, determined fingers, as she did approximately 40 times a day. "That's Mommy's locket, Lily," Lily responded by grabbing harder and saying something that sounded like, "Gah." "Good point," Grace said. The television in the living room was on, tuned to the evening news. Grace heard the anchor's voice through the open terrace door. In legal news today, former attorney Dylan Crawford was sentenced to 22 months in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. Crawford, who was a senior partner at the Manhattan law firm Crawford and Mercer before its acquisition by Bennett Capital Partners, last year, will report to a minimum security facility in Otisville, New York, in January. Grace turned and looked at the television through the glass door. She saw a brief image of Dylan being escorted from a federal courthouse, wearing a gray suit that didn't fit him properly, flanked by a public defender. He looked thin. He looked old. He looked like someone Grace almost didn't recognize. She watched for 3 seconds. Then she walked inside, picked up the remote, and turned off the television. Elena was sitting on the couch, eating Thai food from a container, her feet up on the coffee table, in direct violation of Sebastian's frequently stated preferences about furniture care. "You okay?" Elena asked. "I'm fine," Grace said. "It's done." And it was done, all of it. Every thread of the story that had begun on a rainy October night when a pregnant woman was thrown out of her own home had been tied off, knotted, and cut. Margaret Crawford had been convicted of fraud in filing false court documents. She received 6 months of probation and 200 hours of community service, which she was completing at a soup kitchen in Newark, wearing a hairnet and serving meals to people she would previously have crossed the street to avoid. A permanent restraining order prohibited her from contacting Grace, Lily, or any member of the Bennett family. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom rental apartment in New Jersey. She called Dylan's old phone number every evening and left messages on a voicemail that was no longer active. The messages were always the same. "I did it for you, Dylan. Everything was for you." Nobody listened. Brittany Voss had been cut off by her father 3 months after the scandal, when it became clear that her association with Dylan was toxic enough to threaten the Voss Industries brand. Richard Voss, with characteristic ruthlessness, had simply changed the locks on the Miami condo and stopped paying her credit card bills. Brittany was now living in a shared apartment in South Beach, selling her designer clothes and handbags through Instagram live broadcasts that attracted an average of 150 viewers, most of whom were there to watch the wreckage. She had started calling herself a phoenix rising from the ashes in her bio, which would have been more convincing if the ashes weren't Gucci and the phoenix wasn't asking followers to Venmo her for a latte. Dylan Crawford entered federal prison in January. Minimum security, 22 months. He would be eligible for early release in 14 months with good behavior. He would exit prison as a disbarred attorney with a felony record, no assets, no connections, and a child support obligation of $10,000 a month that would follow him for the next 17 years. What he would do with this life was, for the first time in his existence, entirely up to him. There was no wife to manage his household, no mother to fight his battles, no mistress to validate his ego, just a man, alone, facing the consequence of every choice he had ever made. Grace did not think about him often. When she did, it was with the distant, muted sadness of someone remembering a house they once lived in that burned down. Not because they missed the house, but because they remembered how it felt to believe it was home. The Lily Bennett Foundation was launched on what would have been Grace and Dylan's 6th anniversary, a piece of timing that Grace chose deliberately and without apology. The foundation began with a $50 million endowment from the Bennett Family Trust, focused on women and children displaced by domestic financial abuse, the particular kind of cruelty where one partner controls all the money and uses it as a weapon. In its first year, the foundation helped 12,000 women. It funded emergency housing, legal representation, financial literacy programs, and job training. It partnered with family courts in 6 states to provide advocates for women going through divorces without legal representation. It created a hotline that received 400 calls in its first week. The townhouse on East 73rd Street, the house where Grace had cooked and cleaned and painted butterflies on nursery walls, was renovated and converted into a transitional home for mothers and children leaving abusive financial situations. It could house 8 families at a time. Grace had kept one detail from the original house, the butterflies in the nursery. She had them restored and preserved under glass, a reminder that something beautiful had existed in that house, even when everything else was ugly. On a Tuesday evening, in late October, Grace attended the Time magazine annual gala, where she was being honored as one of the publication's Women of the Year. She wore a simple black dress, the platinum locket, no diamonds, no tiara, no designer label visible anywhere on her body. She looked exactly like who she was, a woman who had survived something terrible and built something extraordinary from the wreckage. Lily was in the front row, sitting on William's lap. She was wearing a tiny dress that Elena had picked out and was chewing on the ear of a stuffed elephant that Sebastian had given her at the hospital and that she had refused to be separated from ever since. William held her with the practiced ease of a man who had spent the last year learning that the most important meetings of his life were the ones that happened on the floor of a penthouse living room with building blocks and a 1-year-old granddaughter who called him Pom. Elena sat beside William. She was wearing a new dress, purchased with her own money from her new salary as the executive director of the Lily Bennett Foundation, a position Grace had offered her and Elena had accepted on the condition that she could still eat Thai food at her desk. Sebastian sat at the end of the row, his posture perfect, his suit immaculate, pretending to review something on his phone, but actually watching the stage with an expression that, if you looked very closely and knew what to look for, might have contained something resembling pride. Grace walked to the podium. The room was full. 500 people, editors and executives and activists and politicians, all watching her. She adjusted the microphone. She looked out at the audience, and then she looked down at Lily. Lily waved, one chubby hand, fingers splayed, the universal baby greeting. The audience laughed. Grace smiled. Then she spoke. 1 year ago, a man gave me $10,000 and told me to be grateful. He said it was more than I deserved for 5 years of marriage. His mother came to our home on our anniversary, the night he served me divorce papers, and she put our unborn baby's clothes in a trash bag while I stood there, 7 months pregnant, and watched. The room was silent. They told me I was nothing, no family, no money, no name. They told me I was the background noise, and for a long time, I believed them. When you hear something enough times from someone you trust, you start to think it must be true. That's how it works. That's how control works. Not with fists, but with words. Not with violence, but with silence. With the slow, daily erosion of a person's belief that they matter. She paused. I got lucky. I found a family I didn't know I had. I found a grandfather who had been looking for me for 25 years. I found a best friend who made a phone call that changed my life. But most women in my situation don't get that phone call. Most women don't find a billionaire grandfather waiting in a car downstairs. Most women leave in the rain with a suitcase and a check, and no one standing on the other side. She looked at the audience. That's why we built this foundation. Not for me, for the women who are standing on the sidewalk right now, tonight, in the rain, with a baby and a suitcase and the crushing belief that they are worth exactly what someone cruel told them they were worth. This award doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every woman who was told she was nothing and chose, in spite of everything, to believe otherwise. Grace looked down at Lily. Lily had stopped chewing the elephant's ear and was reaching both arms toward the stage, making a sound that was almost certainly an attempt to say mama. Grace stepped away from the podium. The room erupted in applause, 500 people on their feet, but Grace didn't hear most of it. She walked down the steps, took Lily from William's arms, and held her daughter against her chest. William put his hand on Grace's shoulder. His eyes were bright. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Elena was crying, openly and without shame. Mascara running in 2 black rivers down her face. She grabbed Grace's free hand and squeezed it hard enough to leave marks. Sebastian stood slightly apart, hands clasped behind his back, looking at a point somewhere above the crowd. His jaw was working. If anyone had asked him later if he had been emotional, he would have said he had something in his eye. Nobody asked, because everybody saw, and nobody wanted to embarrass the man who had helped bring a family back together. They walked out of the gala together, Grace and Lily, William, Elena, Sebastian. 5 people who 1 year ago had been scattered across the city and across the decades, separated by paperwork and tragedy and a system that had lost a baby in its gears. Now they walked through the lobby of a Manhattan hotel like what they were, a family. Grace didn't look back. She had spent too much of her life looking back at foster homes and empty mailboxes and a marriage that had never been what she thought it was. She was done with backward. She was done with the version of herself that accepted cruelty because she didn't know she deserved better. The night air hit them as they stepped outside. October in New York, cool, crisp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and taxi exhaust and the particular electric energy of a city that never stops moving. Lily pressed her face into Grace's neck and yawned. "Somebody's tired," Elena said. "Somebody gave a very long speech," Grace said. "Somebody was incredible." Grace held Lily closer. She looked up at the sky, which was clear for once, and she could see a handful of stars fighting through the city light, faint but there. She thought about the night she left the townhouse, the rain, the sidewalk, the suitcase, the locket, the $10,000 and the closing door and the sound of champagne being opened in the house she had just been thrown out of. She thought about how she had walked 6 blocks through the rain to Elena's apartment, one hand on her belly, believing she was alone in the world. She had been wrong. She had never been alone. She had a best friend who would make a phone call at midnight on a hunch. She had a grandfather who had searched for her for a quarter of a century. She had a daughter who was, at this very moment, drooling on her locket. And she had herself, Grace Miller, Grace Bennett, Grace Eleanor, whose parents had loved her enough to engrave her name in platinum before they left the world, a waitress, an heiress, a mother, a woman who had been told she was nothing and had gotten up off the sidewalk anyway. The car pulled up. William held the door. Grace slid inside with Lily, and Elena piled in after her, already pulling out her phone to order Thai food for the ride home. The car pulled away from the curb and merged into the river of lights that was Manhattan at night. Grace looked down at Lily, who had fallen asleep against her chest, one tiny hand still gripping the locket. "We're going home, baby girl," Grace whispered, and for the first time in her life, she meant it. Grace Bennett didn't destroy Dylan Crawford. She simply stopped carrying him, and when she let go, he discovered he had never learned to stand on his own. Some men spend their whole lives building castles. Dylan Crawford spent his tearing one down, and he never realized that the foundation he had been standing on was her. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, I need you to do me a favor. Hit that like button. It really does help the channel more than you know. And if you want more stories about karma, redemption, and secrets that change everything, subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss one. Now I want to hear from you. Was Grace too kind, or did Dylan get exactly what he deserved? Drop your verdict in the comments, Team Grace or Team Mercy. I read every single one, and remember, be careful how you treat the quiet ones. They might be the ones running the world. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.